Why are there so many of them? Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and today I'm going to introduce you to what I call the 4 archetypes of bureaucrats, so that you can identify them, understand why they act the way they do, and to give you some options for dealing with them. Actually, the basic TTP is going to be the same for all of them. The Colonel or GS-15 Director, what you're going to want to do is assign some bright, young, innocent Major or GS-12 to work with these people. But the particular type of new guy that you pair is going to depend on the type of bureaucrat you're dealing with, and you'll see why in a second. Okay, the 4 archetypes are the grumpy old man, the grays, the old warhorse, and the little old ladies in tennis shoes. The first and most obvious bureaucrat is the grumpy old man. This character is almost always male, and they can be identified by their catchphrase, "We tried that before and it didn't work." The other way to spot a grumpy old man is that in meetings they'll be sitting with their arms crossed, just trying to prevent themselves from interrupting people. The reason that grumpy old men are like this is because they've been around long enough to see this exact same problem multiple times. They've seen different leaders try to solve the problem in different ways, but the problem is still here. And that's despite the fact that those leaders, well, they've gone on to new assignments and promotions. So the grumpy old men are right. Whatever course of action the current leadership is cooking up, well, it probably has been tried before, and it probably didn't work. But what really makes the grumpy old man so grumpy is that over the years he has put some serious blood and sweat into genuinely trying to resolve this issue. And somehow he ends up getting blamed for the fact that the problem still exists, as if his efforts weren't big enough. And all of that despite the fact that nobody actually listens to him. It is a vicious cycle where the grumpy old man becomes more belligerent, more insufferable, and less likely that people will listen to him. Oh, and he gets more grumpy. As you'll see with all the bureaucratic archetypes, the main solution to the grumpy old man is to pair them with a well-meaning and youthful soul. The key attribute of this young action officer who's going to work with a grumpy old man, the key attribute is listening skills. They need to be able to listen to long, angry rants about how everything is screwed up and it's only going to get worse. And of course, the reason for all of this listening is not to soothe the grumpy old man, because trust me, ain't nothing going to do that. Goal is for this young action officer to pick out the key points that can improve the likelihood of success, and then to convey those points to leadership in a low intensity, not grumpy kind of way. Now, on the complete opposite end of the emotional spectrum, you have the grays. These are dull, inert, pasty button pushers. But do not let their demeanor deceive you. Of all the bureaucrats that we're going to talk about today, the grays tend to have the greatest influence over leadership. And that has to do with the real role of the grays. Many organizations have what I would call a centerpiece software application. It's a system built around the organization's primary mission and designed to answer common questions that come from DoD and Congress. You might imagine that the personnel office has a database with information about every single individual in the organization. The training office has a system to record and schedule classes, etc. The grays are the people who either control or in some cases personally enter the data that's included in those systems. The grays make changes to key data fields and the reports that the system generates. You see, that's why they have so much influence. It's because they are the human embodiment of the data system. If you want to change the system, you have to get their support. And just so you know what's coming, when you have some bright new idea about how to change the system, they are going to look you dead in the eye without a spark of emotion and just say no. Now, none of this means that the system can't be changed. The system can even be changed against their will, but that kind of change will always be directed by a general officer or an SES who has direct proponency for the system. And even then, the Greys will proceed with extreme caution. Which brings us to the type of action officer that you would pair with a Grey. You want a sympathetic and analytically minded action officer. And the role of this action officer is it's really two-part. Number one, the organization needs to develop some new people with a relatively deep understanding of the system, its history, its data, and its limitations. That action officer will never get as deep as the Grey, but you need somebody who tries to get close. And number two, in many cases, the organization needs to take as much advantage of the information contained in that system as possible. But they got to do it without changing anything, and particularly without corrupting the data. So this action officer, working closely with the Grey, should be pulling information and analyzing it offline. This can either help address needs that the system really wasn't designed to answer, or it can help prototype future changes that might be considered. Next, let's talk about the old warhorse. At first glance, the old warhorse is the most congenial of all the bureaucrats we're going to talk about today. But in a second, you'll see why that in and of itself might be a danger. The defining trait of the old warhorse is they are always ready to head off on the next crusade. You will meet these scrawny, bent-over 70, 75-year-olds whose ears just prick up at the call to arms. They will sally forth with a gleam in their eyes and 29 years worth of notes tucked under their arms. On the face of things, this seems great. And properly managed, they are great. But the thing about an old warhorse is they tend to have a mind of their own. And they tend to do what they think needs to be done without asking for guidance. This can be particularly problematic when they have their own agenda or desired outcomes that conflict with what leadership wants. But either way, there is a simple solution, and that is to pair the old warhorse with a young rider. You know, somebody who follows along with the old warhorse, doesn't necessarily try to steer them, but keeps leadership informed of how things are progressing. This can be a great assignment for an action officer who's kind of a wallflower. I always think it's funny because usually an action officer who's kind of a shrinking violet, well, they're not very useful. But in this case, it's handy to have somebody who doesn't fight with the old warhorse. A grumpy old man or a Grey, they tolerate and in fact kind of expect a certain amount of resistance. But an old warhorse who has an action officer trying to force him to go where he doesn't want to go, well, they have a tendency to just shut that kind of action officer out. But a quiet, watchful action officer who just kind of tags along and makes sure that things are heading in the right direction, that can be very useful. And the added advantage of this partnership is that quiet action officer can start to build their own sense of confidence just by watching the old warhorse work. All right, now for the fourth and I think most fascinating character within the bureaucracy, the little old ladies in tennis shoes. As the name implies, these characters are almost always female, and as crazy as it sounds, you can identify them by their footwear. I suggest that when you run into a woman who's wearing $100 tennis shoes, sneakers, that are color coordinated with her outfit, proceed with caution. As one friend of mine pointed out, little old ladies in tennis shoes will charm the pants off the Pope, but they are equally happy shivving you in the kidney if that's what needs to be done. But the really important thing are those tennis shoes, because they're emblematic of a transformation that this person has undergone. You see, once upon a time, the little old lady in tennis shoes wore high heels to work. They looked very professional, and they hurt like hell. And then one day, the little old lady in tennis shoes thought, I don't have to put up with these high heels hurting my feet every day. I could just wear tennis shoes. And then the transformation was underway. She looked around and she's like, I don't have to put up with that pain in the butt major anymore. And then the little old lady in tennis shoes is sitting in some meeting and she's like, I don't have to hold my tongue all the time. So nowadays, somebody proposes some bright new way of doing things, and the little old lady in tennis shoes is perfectly happy saying, well, that's a stupid idea. Now, the funny thing about this transformation, and I've watched quite a few professional women go through it, is that as it happens, they seem to become remarkably more social. They become less worried about what people think, and they start forming relationships all over the building. It's kind of like they get inducted into a secret society, and they can get a remarkable amount of work done through this network of little old ladies in tennis shoes. But the strange thing is that while they don't hesitate to speak up to their chain of command, because honestly, the lieutenant colonel is the same age as their oldest child, they do tend to avoid getting their hands dirty in public. In fact, they seem to steer away from any nastiness that might negatively affect their new status or relationships. This is where a junior partner can become very valuable. What you do is you pair a little old lady in tennis shoes with some overly aggressive firebrand combat officer. Let that hotshot go to meetings with both guns blazing, and watch the little old lady in tennis shoes leverage that energy. Oh, you don't want to play nice? Well, I can bring Major Horowitz to the next meeting. Oh, you're mad because Major Horowitz was so blunt? Well, I'll talk to him about his tone, but he's not wrong. Some other officer wants to talk down to the little old lady in tennis shoes. Hey, Major Horowitz, light him up. You would be amazed how far this little partnership can go. And in the meantime, guess what Major Horowitz is learning? He's learning that sometimes he too can get more done with a gentle hand than an iron fist. And so you're going to run into all four of these characters and more as you rise in the ranks of the bureaucracy and become a mover and shaker in your own right. And on first contact, you're probably not going to like any of them. But not only can you and your staff learn to make the most of these incredibly talented teammates, you too will one day be one of them. You might not exactly get to pick what kind of bureaucrat you turn into, but hopefully you'll get enough experience with all of them so that you can understand yourself better. And now, if you want to see another quirky take on the different types of bureaucrats that you'll run into, watch this video.